today I'm going to talk about my lived experience of open access across two hemispheres. As you can hear, I have an Australian accent, but between 2015 to 2019, I worked at Cambridge University as the Deputy Director of the Library with responsibility for scholarly communication and research services. And my time there coincided with a huge upheaval as the Finch Report and the subsequent Research Council's UK and Research Excellence Framework policies came into effect. I'd already been heavily involved in open space. I was growing my new baby boy and writing my PhD on researcher engagement with open access between 2004 and 2008. And I worked on several projects during that time that looked at research infrastructure for open as part of a very forward-looking tranche of government infrastructure funding. At the time, Australia was leading the world here, and this was the early 2000s. The first Open Repositories Conference was held at Sydney University in 2006. And Australia had a very clear green open access strategy. So after my PhD, I held a scholarly communication position at the Australian National University for 4 years and then created the Australasian Open Access Strategy Group, which I worked on for 2. And so today I'm going to talk about how the open access community is not singing from the same song sheet. Let me tell you, changing hemispheres is really tough. The academic year's upside down. It's cold at Christmas. But the thing that really hit me was that the open discussion was at a completely different level. And there were a few reasons for this. The policy landscape was pushing a new agenda, but one of the main factors is just the sheer scale. So Australia's big, it's huge. So just before flying to the UK, my family drove around Australia, 26,000 kilometres over 5 months. But there are under 26 million people here, and there are nearly 3 times as many people in the UK. On a much, much smaller landmass. And Britain's right next to Europe. So the fantasy from here is, oh, everything's only 2 hours away. And in reality, of course, it is often a full day's travel. But nonetheless, you're right next to discussions, events, workshops, working groups, all the things that are going on. In famous words of an ex-Prime Minister here, the times suited me, but they didn't suit my family, and we did make the decision to return back to Australia. And let me tell you, there's such a thing as reverse culture shock. I thought I was coming home, but we moved to a new city and that had its own challenges. And then what I saw on the return in the open space was things that almost stood still here. In some aspects, they'd gone backwards since I'd left. There was still no cohesion of funder policies or approaches. There was still no national discussion. There are still lots of pockets of activity, but they're often invitation-only events, like they're held behind closed doors. And the conversations are still focused on open access. Open research is only just moving into these discussions. We don't talk about reproducibility, and any discussions that exist about research culture are very much in their infancy. And now with the move to read and publish agreements, there is no discussion about what implications that has for our ostensibly green open access strategy. So as an example of the problem, I recently completed an analysis with some colleagues on open access policies in Australian universities. It's out as a preprint now and is going through the peer review process. Fewer than half of the universities even have an open access policy in Australia. Those that do are not convergent on questions of payment for publication, on positions on hybrid, on the purpose of the policy, or indeed even what the definition of open access is in the policies. Now, consistently in this space, I've found that the most effective method of managing change and meeting the challenges of open is being prepared to have open discussions. And the most important factor is acknowledging that this is complicated, that there's no finished answer, that we will make mistakes, and that's okay. That solutions and knowledge might be held in surprising places. And that's why an invitation-only approach is not ideal. It assumes that you've managed to invite all the right people into the room. In the worst case scenarios, big mistakes can happen. And in the last few weeks, one of our only 2 government funding bodies here, the Australian Research Council, ARC, hit the international news over a new rule they'd introduced to one of their early career funding programs, which excluded any applications that mentioned, not cited, mentioned preprints. Now, the fact that they brought in this rule is shocking enough, and there was huge pushback, and the ARC is now back down. But the real scandal here is none of the university's research officers felt this was noteworthy enough to query it. It wasn't until after the selection process had occurred and some applications had been rejected that the outcry began. And that to me speaks to the low level of understanding of the implications and the conversations that are happening overseas from this perspective. How are we in a position where the level of engagement with what's happening at such a fundamentally shifting level overseas doesn't scratch the surface here? Well, I'd suggest there are a few reasons, but the main one is distance. Australia is a really, really long way away. When we knew we were moving to Cambridge, we went to a library and found a globe, and we put our finger on Canberra, where we were living, and we put the finger of the other hand onto Cambridge, and our fingers were pointing to one another. We were literally going to the opposite side of the world. So the idea to just popping across to an event in Europe is not feasible. Leaving COVID Fortress Australia aside, the cost is phenomenal for the trip, and to make it worthwhile, you need at least a week, usually 2. It's the jet lag. And I promise you, none of you have experienced jet lag unless you've traveled to Australia or New Zealand. But in this online environment, there's a greater opportunity for people who could never previously attend events due to cost or time off work. And I'm on the steering committee for OAI 12 Geneva Conference, Innovations in Scholarly Communication. We normally have about 250 people attend in person, but last month when we ran it, we had close to 1,000 attendees. It's a whole new scale. So that's good, isn't it? But let's talk about time zones. As we've said, it's 11:30 p.m. for me now. I'm on steering committees, editorial boards, I speak at workshops, I run various events, and they're all held in Northern Hemisphere time zones. So in any given week, I'd have several early morning and very late night meetings outside of a 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. workday. It really sucks when they're on the same day. So staying up to date comes at a huge personal cost if you're living in the Southern Hemisphere. I do all of these external committees on top of my full-time job. I'm often very tired, but this is also my research area of interest. I'm vested. I've had lived experience and personal contacts. In fact, I know many of the people on this panel, but that's not the experience for most people here in Australia. In a place like Australia, it's very easy to pretend the rest of the world isn't there. I mean, I won't mention our appalling record on climate change, which is one example of this phenomenon. So it's very difficult to stay in touch, and there's only so much you can do with Twitter. So my message here is, if we really want to have a global conversation, if we do want to have an open and shared conversation, then occasionally it's going to have to be in a time zone that's not comfortable for you. So I'd like to see these discussions open up. And part of that's a cultural change that has to happen here. But it would be much easier if the innovative and exciting discussions were accessible to those people here who are interested and can bring their own knowledge and experience to the table. Discuss.
Thanks a lot, Danny. That was really a power nap, obviously, at least measured by the results. So any questions to Danny? I find it really an interesting observation that globalization, which we have obviously seen in so many industries and so many fields, where it presumably doesn't make any difference for people what time it is in any other place of the world, that it does make, in your own experience, quite a difference, and that it also disadvantages certain regions, which are not like by coincidence between other continents, like Europe, for example, is to really participate in this. This is an interesting one.
It's very challenging. I've been involved, on several steering committees, and one of them's the Force 11 Scholarly Communications Initiative. And one of the solutions that we've got for that event is to actually run each of the sessions twice, so that we've got options for the different time zones. And actually, as it turned out, with our more pleasant for me 10 a.m. rather than 1 a.m. session, from my point of view, we had quite a few US-based people who for them it worked because it was outside their working hours and they were able to fit it in. So there's multiple benefits beyond what I'm talking about for many reasons for sort of shifting it up a little bit, I think.
This certainly seems to be a theme that we're hearing a few times about access and inclusion in this process of change. Clearly, not everybody is being included or feels like they're being included. Apart from having events at odd hours, Danny, do you think there's other things that the industry can do to reach out or to make this transition and these, communicating these trends more inclusive? And not just for time zones, but for, I don't know, people from different institutions or different languages or different backgrounds?
Yeah, well, I was going to bring up the language because, of course, we all are speaking in English here. And actually at the OAI conference, one of our presenters spoke in French, and we had somebody doing sort of live translation of that, which is starting to help. I think it's very interesting when you start talking to people from other cultures, because a lot of what is driving behaviour is the sort of incentive process. And in Australia, we are very, very vested in university ranking systems, extremely vested, partly because the overseas student model was holding up the entire higher education sector, which has caused something of a problem because COVID, of course, has cut off that revenue stream. We've had the industry's area has been devastated by this. We've lost 40,000 jobs in the higher education sector in Australia, and that's out of only 41 universities, so you can start to understand the scale of the problem. But the issue is that the discussions tend to be not just in Northern Hemisphere time zones, but about Northern Hemisphere focus. So there isn't a recognition that there's lots of other activity. Indonesia, for example, which is one of our closest neighbours here, is doing huge amounts of work in the open access space. They're a really, really successful country, and you never hear about it. So we sort of ignore this kind of whole other world of work in this space where we could learn quite a lot from what's going on. And they're having conversations about what can we do more? How can we be better? And you think, well, you're doing pretty well from where we're standing. So I think opening up the conversations to how things are working in different countries would really help everybody. But that also might need not only a time zone issue, but a language one as well, some way of managing that. And it's not easy. I absolutely 100% acknowledge that.
Of course, but it sounds like there's a need to make the effort, for sure. We do have a question.
Absolutely, which there will be no quick answer to, I'm afraid, right? There seems to be momentum now to move to a national OA strategy for Australia. Can you say a bit more about that, please?
Yeah, so we've got a new chief scientist as of this year that we get. That's a position that changes every 3 years, and it's Dr. Kathy Foley, and she's put forward her four sort of pillars of what she's wanting to focus on, one of which is women in STEM, but another one's open access. And she's looking at having a national strategy for open access. And this is a really fantastic opportunity for the country to have such a high level interest that we haven't had before. And we are conscious, though, that discussion is specifically about open access. It's something that she has said she's deliberately chosen to do. Some people sometimes mix up open access and open scholarship. That's not the case here. She is quite deliberately focusing on open access because she wants to achieve something in the time and feels that the open scholarship challenge is too big, which I absolutely understand. So while it's a very good step in the right direction, I sort of feel in some ways it's Australia's Finch. Finch happened in 2012. This moment will happen in 2022. So it does indicate a decade, but at least we're moving forward. Let's be positive on that one.